Sometimes the deepest loneliness comes not from being alone, but from believing you'll never matter to anyone again. For 15 years, widowed rancher Eli McGraw has lived with that hollow ache, talking only to his horse and drinking himself to sleep beside his wife's unfinished quilt. One stormy night in 1887, a desperate young woman appears at his barn door with 3 newborn babies, begging for shelter. The bitter old cowboy lets them stay, planning to send them away come morning. But when the sun rises, the whole town discovers something nobody expected. Eli is holding one of the babies, calling for the doctor, and declaring he's giving this strange woman his home and his family name. What could make a man who's given up on life suddenly fight to save strangers? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind had been howling across the Colorado Territory for 3 days straight, carrying with it the scent of rain and the promise of a storm that would test every weathered board and rusted nail in Cedar Ridge. Eli McGraw stood at his kitchen window, watching the cottonwoods bend nearly sideways in the gusts, their leaves showing silver bellies like frightened fish. At 62, he'd seen enough storms to know this one would be different. The air itself felt electric, charged with something more than moisture. His cabin sat 2 miles outside town, a modest structure he'd built with his own hands 23 years ago when he'd brought Martha home as his bride. Back then, the logs had been golden pine, fresh-cut and fragrant. Now they'd weathered to the color of old pewter, and the chinking between them needed attention he couldn't bring himself to give. What was the point of maintaining a home when you were the only one living in it? Eli ran his weathered fingers along the windowsill, feeling the familiar groove worn smooth by years of the same gesture. Martha used to stand here in the mornings, humming while she watched for the sunrise. She'd had a voice like warm honey, and even now, 15 years after consumption had taken her, he sometimes caught himself listening for those gentle melodies that had once filled this house with life. The kitchen still held traces of her presence. The blue ceramic pitcher she'd loved sat on the shelf above the dry sink, though Eli hadn't used it since her funeral. Her apron hung on a peg by the stove, faded now from cornflower blue to the pale shade of winter sky. He'd tried taking it down once, about 5 years after she'd passed, but his hands had trembled so badly he'd nearly dropped it. Some things, he'd learned, were meant to stay exactly where they were. In the bedroom, Martha's unfinished quilt lay folded at the foot of the bed they'd once shared. She'd been working on a wedding ring pattern, dozens of interlocking circles in calico prints of rose and cream and soft green. The needle was still stuck in the fabric where she'd left it that last morning when the coughing had started again and never really stopped. Eli touched that quilt every night before he went to sleep, running his thumb over the precise stitches that would never be completed. He'd tried to finish it himself in those first desperate months after her death, but his large, calloused hands couldn't manage the delicate work. The quilt remained as she'd left it, a testament to dreams interrupted and love preserved in cotton and thread. The ranch itself had once been a thriving operation. Eli had run cattle on 300 acres of good grassland, with a creek running year-round through the property. He'd employed 2 hands and had plans to expand, maybe build a proper barn to replace the lean-to structure that currently housed his aging sorrel gelding, Buck. But after Martha died, something fundamental had broken inside him. The cattle were sold off one by one. The hired hands found work elsewhere. Now only Buck remained, a 20-year-old horse with arthritis in his joints and cataracts clouding his brown eyes. Eli talked to Buck more than he talked to any human being. Every morning, he'd shuffle out to the lean-to with a bucket of grain, and Buck would whicker softly in greeting. They understood each other, these 2 old bachelors. Buck had been Martha's favorite, a gentle giant who'd let her braid flowers in his mane during the spring months when wildflowers carpeted the meadow. Now he and Eli shared a quiet companionship built on routine and the comfort of familiar presence. Cedar Ridge had been founded in 1869, 18 years earlier, by a group of former Union soldiers looking for a fresh start after the war. The town had grown slowly but steadily, attracting ranchers, merchants, and the occasional drifter seeking opportunity in the expanding West. Main Street boasted a general store run by Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, a stern widow with opinions about everything and everyone. There was Doc Harrison's medical practice, housed in a neat white building with green shutters, and the Silver Dollar Saloon, where the local men gathered to play cards and share news. Sheriff Tom Bradley kept the peace with a steady hand and a fair temperament. He'd been elected 3 times running, which said something about his character in a territory where lawmen often didn't last through their first term. Tom had served under Eli during the war, though. That was a connection neither man spoke about publicly. Some memories were best left buried. Doc Harrison was perhaps the closest thing Eli had to a friend, though even that relationship had grown distant over the years. Samuel Harrison had delivered Martha's stillborn son, had held Eli's shoulders when the grief threatened to break him entirely. The doctor still stopped by occasionally, ostensibly to check on Buck's arthritis, but really to make sure Eli wasn't drinking himself to death or worse. They'd sit on the porch, sharing a bottle of whiskey and watching the sun set behind the mountains, talking about weather and horses and anything except the ghosts that haunted them both. Mrs. Patterson viewed Eli with a mixture of pity and disapproval. She remembered the man he'd been before, polite, hard-working, quick to help a neighbor in need. The Eli McGraw who came to town now was a different creature altogether. He bought his supplies with minimal conversation, paid his bills on time, and disappeared back to his ranch as quickly as possible. He'd grown a beard that he trimmed only when it threatened to tangle in his food, and his clothes, while clean, showed the careful mending of a man who'd learned to make things last. The townspeople had theories about Eli McGraw. Some said he'd never gotten over losing Martha and the baby in the same year. Others whispered that the war had damaged something in him that couldn't be repaired, and Martha's love had been the only thing holding him together. A few of the more charitable souls occasionally sent food or offered invitations to church socials, but Eli always declined politely, and eventually they'd stopped asking. On this particular evening, as the storm gathered strength and the first fat raindrops began to spatter against the windows, Eli sat in his kitchen with a plate of beans and salt pork, listening to the wind test every joint and beam of his cabin. Buck was secure in the lean-to, with fresh hay and enough grain to last through whatever the night might bring. Eli had chopped enough wood to keep the fire going, and his pantry held supplies for a week if necessary. He'd learned to be self-sufficient in all things. When a man lived alone, he couldn't afford to depend on others for the necessities of life. He taught himself to cook simple meals, to mend his clothes, to doctor both himself and Buck when minor ailments struck. It wasn't the life he'd planned, but it was the life he'd been given, and he'd made his peace with it. Outside, the storm was building to something fierce. The wind had shifted direction, coming now from the north with the bite of mountain snow in it. The temperature was dropping fast, and Eli could see his breath beginning to fog in the suddenly cold air. He banked the fire in the stove, checked the latch on the door, and prepared to ride out whatever nature had in store. He was just settling into his chair with a cup of coffee and the week-old newspaper Tom Bradley had given him when the first knock came. Soft at first, barely audible over the storm's fury. Then louder, more insistent. Eli froze, cup halfway to his lips. In 15 years of hermit-like existence, no one had ever come to his door after dark. The knocking came again, and this time he heard something that made his blood run cold, the thin, desperate cry of a woman in distress, and underneath it, the unmistakable wail of infants. Eli set down his coffee cup with hands that trembled slightly, the china clicking against the wooden table. The sound came again, a woman's voice, high and desperate, calling something he couldn't make out over the storm's roar, and those cries, thin and urgent, that could only be coming from babies. He rose slowly, his joints protesting after a day of ranch work. At 62, his body reminded him daily of every hard ride, every fence post driven, every night spent sleeping on frozen ground during the war. but the sounds from beyond his door drove away all thoughts of aches and pains. Someone was out there in this storm, someone with children, and they needed help. Eli moved to the door, his bare feet silent on the wooden floor. He pressed his ear to the thick planks, listening. The knocking came again, weaker now, and he heard words carried on the wind. "Please me, babies, I beg you." His hand was on the latch before he'd made a conscious decision to open it. The storm hit him like a physical blow, driving rain into his face and soaking his shirt in seconds. The woman on his doorstep swayed on her feet, clutching something to her chest. She was young, maybe 25, with dark hair plastered to her skull, and clothes that had once been good quality, but were now torn and mud-stained. "Help me," she gasped, and he saw what she carried, 3 tiny bundles wrapped in what looked like pieces of her own skirt. "Please, sir, my babies, they're so cold." Eli didn't hesitate. He stepped aside, pulling the door wide. "Get inside, quickly now." She stumbled past him into the warm kitchen, dripping rainwater onto his clean floor. Up close, he could see she was exhausted beyond measure, her face gaunt with hunger and her lips blue with cold. The bundles in her arms moved weakly, and he heard the mewling cries of newborns. "Sit," he commanded, pulling out the chair closest to the stove. "Get those babies near the heat." She sank into the chair gratefully, adjusting her grip on the infants. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I saw your light, and I didn't know where else." "Don't apologize." Eli was already moving, grabbing clean dish towels from the drawer, stoking the fire in the stove until it blazed hot and bright. "How long have you been out in this storm?" Since this afternoon." Her voice was barely audible. "We took shelter under some rocks when it started, but the water kept rising, and I was afraid." She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Eli had seen enough flash floods in this country to know how quickly they could turn deadly. He knelt beside her chair, looking at the 3 tiny faces peering out from their makeshift blankets. They couldn't be more than a few weeks old, their features still carrying that otherworldly look of the newly born. "Triplets," he said, and it wasn't a question. She nodded, tears mixing with the rainwater on her cheeks. "James, Mary, and Joseph, born 3 weeks ago." Her voice broke. "I've been traveling ever since." Eli felt something shift inside his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced in 15 years. These babies, these impossibly small human beings, needed protection. They needed warmth and food and safety, and right now, he was the only one who could provide it. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Sarah," she whispered. "Sarah Fletcher." "Well, Sarah Fletcher, you and your babies are safe now." He stood, his knees creaking. "Let me get some proper blankets." He returned with Martha's quilts, the good ones she'd finished before she got sick. He hadn't touched them in years, but somehow it felt right to wrap these babies in something made with love. Sarah accepted them gratefully, rearranging the children with the careful movements of a woman who'd learned to manage 3 infants alone. "There's stew on the stove," Eli said. "When did you last eat?" "Yesterday morning." She looked embarrassed. "I had a little bread left, but I gave it to." She gestured helplessly at the babies. Eli ladled stew into a bowl, setting it on the table beside her. "Eat, I'll hold one of the babies if you need me to." She looked at him with surprise and something that might have been hope. "You would do that?" "They're babies," he said simply. "Of course I would." She handed him the smallest of the 3, the one she'd called James. The infant fit easily in Eli's large hands, weighing no more than a barn cat. James looked up at him with solemn dark eyes, and Eli felt his heart perform a strange, painful twist. When had he last held a baby? Not since that terrible day when Martha had labored for 18 hours to deliver their son, only to have the child slip away before he'd drawn his first breath. But this baby was alive, warm and breathing and perfect. James made a soft sound, not quite a cry, and Eli found himself rocking slightly, the motion as natural as breathing. "He likes you," Sarah said, taking her first spoonful of stew. She ate carefully, like someone who'd learned not to waste food. "He's been so fussy since we left." She stopped abruptly, as if she'd said too much. "Left where?" Eli asked, but gently. Sarah's hands stilled on her spoon. "It doesn't matter now. We can't go back." There was something in her voice, a fear that went deeper than worry about storms or cold. Eli had heard that tone before, from soldiers who'd seen too much, from women who'd suffered at the hands of men who should have protected them. He didn't push for details. "You're welcome to stay the night," he said instead. "All of you. The storm should blow itself out by morning." Relief flooded her face. "Thank you. I promise we'll be gone as soon as—" "We'll see about that." The words surprised him as much as they seemed to surprise her. Babies this young shouldn't be traveling in weather like this. He looked down at James, who had fallen asleep in his arms with the complete trust that only the very young possessed. Something inside Eli's chest, something that had been frozen solid for 15 years, began to crack and shift. Sarah finished her stew in silence, watching him hold her son with an expression he couldn't quite read. When she was done, he helped her settle all 3 babies on a nest of quilts near the stove, where they would stay warm through the night. "You can have the bedroom," he said. "I'll sleep out here by the fire." "I couldn't take your bed." "The babies will wake during the night. You'll need the rest." He was already pulling extra blankets from the chest, making himself a pallet on the kitchen floor. "Go on now. Get some sleep." She hesitated at the bedroom door. "Mr. I don't even know your name." "Eli McGraw." "Mr. McGraw, I can't thank you enough. You saved our lives tonight." After she'd gone into the bedroom and closed the door, Eli sat by the stove, listening to the storm rage outside and the soft breathing of 3 tiny children. One of them, Mary, he thought stirred and made a small sound, and he found himself reaching out to pat her back gently until she settled again. What was he doing? In the morning, he should send them on their way. He had no business taking in strangers, especially a woman with babies. The town would talk, and he'd worked hard to maintain his reputation as a man who wanted to be left alone. But as he looked at those 3 innocent faces, peaceful now in the warmth and safety of his kitchen, Eli McGraw made a decision that would change everything. Come morning, he wasn't sending them anywhere. Dawn broke clear and cold, the storm having blown itself out sometime before sunrise. Eli woke to the sound he hadn't heard in his house for 15 years, the crying of babies. Not distressed cries, but the normal, healthy demands of infants who wanted feeding and attention. He sat up on his makeshift bed, bones protesting the night spent on the hard floor. The kitchen was warm from the banked fire, and sunlight streamed through the windows, making everything look different somehow. Brighter, more alive. Sarah was already awake, sitting in the rocking chair he'd brought from the bedroom, nursing one of the babies, while the other 2 lay content on their nest of quilts. She looked up when she heard him stirring, and he saw that some color had returned to her cheeks. "Good morning," she said softly. "I hope we didn't wake you too early." "I'm always up with the sun." Eli stretched, working the kinks out of his back. "How did they sleep?" "Better than they have in weeks." She looked down at the baby in her arms, James by his small size. "I think they felt safe for the first time since we left home." There was that word again, home, and the way she said left suggested it hadn't been by choice. Eli filed away his questions for later and went about his morning routine, starting coffee and setting out the ingredients for breakfast. "I can cook," Sarah offered, but he waved her back to the chair. "You just tend to those babies. I've been cooking for myself for 15 years. As he worked, cracking eggs into the skillet and slicing bread from yesterday's loaf, he found himself stealing glances at the makeshift nursery by the stove. Mary, the girl, had kicked free of her blanket and was waving tiny fists in the air, studying them with the intense concentration of someone discovering hands for the first time. Joseph, the 3rd baby, lay quietly watching the play of sunlight on the ceiling, his dark eyes following the patterns with unusual focus for one so young. When Sarah finished nursing James, Eli surprised himself by offering to hold the baby while she ate. James settled against his chest as naturally as if he belonged there, one small hand grasping Eli's shirt front. The weight of him, the warmth, the sweet baby scented, all combined to create a sensation Eli had forgotten existed. Purpose. The feeling that he mattered to someone, even if that someone was only a few weeks old. "You're good with him," Sarah observed, accepting the plate of eggs and bread he'd prepared. "Had some practice once." The words slipped out before he could stop them. Sarah looked at him with gentle curiosity but didn't press. Instead, she asked, "Would it be too much trouble to stay another day? I know you must want us gone, but James has been sick, and I'm worried about traveling with him so soon after." "Stay as long as you need." The words came out gruffer than he intended, but he saw relief wash over her face. "Thank you. I promise we won't be any trouble." Trouble, if only she knew. These 3 babies had already turned his carefully ordered world upside down, and he was surprised to find he didn't mind. For the first time in 15 years, his house felt alive. After breakfast, while Sarah rested with the babies, Eli rode Buck into town for supplies. He needed milk and eggs, proper baby clothes, if Mrs. Patterson had any, and he wanted to talk to Doc Harrison about James, who seemed smaller and more fragile than his siblings. The ride gave him time to think about what he was doing. Taking in a woman and 3 babies wasn't a decision to make lightly. The town would talk hell. They were probably already talking. A hermit like him, suddenly playing host to strangers, would set tongues wagging from the silver dollar to the church steps. But every time he thought about sending them away, he remembered the weight of James in his arms, the trust in those dark baby eyes. These children needed protection, and Sarah was clearly running from something or someone. The fear he'd seen in her eyes last night wasn't about storms or cold. Cedar Ridge's main street was busy with morning commerce. Eli tied Buck to the rail outside Patterson's general store and steeled himself for the inevitable questions. Eleanor Patterson was a good woman at heart, but she had an opinion about everything and the social subtlety of a cavalry charge. "Eli McGraw," she said the moment he walked through the door. "Didn't expect to see you in town 2 days in a row. Need some supplies. I heard you had visitors last night." She leaned across the counter, eyes bright with curiosity. "Mary Hutchins saw a light in your kitchen quite late. Said it looked like you had company." Eli selected his words carefully. "Woman with 3 babies got caught in the storm. Gave them shelter." 3 babies? Mrs. Patterson's eyebrows shot up. Land's sakes, what was she doing out in weather like that with newborns? "Don't know. Need milk, eggs, and whatever baby clothes you might have." Mrs. Patterson bustled around gathering his order, all the while peppering him with questions he deflected or ignored. But when she produced a basket of baby clothestiny gowns and blankets that previous customers had outgrown her, expression softened. "These were donated to the church," she said, "for families in need. I suppose that would include your visitors. I'll pay for them." "Nonsense. Take them with my blessing." She paused in her packing. "Eli, are you sure you know what you're doing? Taking in strangers, especially a woman with babies, people will talk. Let them talk." His next stop was Doc Harrison's office. Samuel Harrison was a tall, thin man with kind eyes and hands that had delivered half the babies in Cedar Ridge. He looked up from his medical journal when Eli entered, surprise flickering across his weathered face. "Eli, what brings you to town?" "Need you to look at a baby. 3 babies, actually." Doc Harrison set down his journal. "I heard rumors. Mrs. Patterson's already been by with half the story." Eli explained about the storm, the woman and children, his concerns about James's size and health. Doc Harrison listened without interruption, his expression growing more thoughtful with each detail. "I'll ride out this afternoon," he said finally. "Newborn triplets, that's unusual. The mother must have had a difficult time. She's been traveling. Looks like she hasn't eaten properly in weeks." "Running from something?" Eli met his old friend's eyes. "Seems likely." Doc Harrison nodded slowly. "Well, babies are babies, regardless of circumstances. I'll bring what I need." The ride home gave Eli more time to think. What was he getting himself into? He'd lived as a hermit for 15 years, and now he was considering taking in a family of strangers. The smart thing would be to help them get back on their feet and send them on their way. But as he approached his cabin and saw Sarah through the window, rocking one of the babies while the other two lay sleeping in their nest of quilts, Eli realized the smart thing wasn't always the right thing. These babies had already claimed a piece of his heart he'd thought was dead and buried with Martha. And maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what he needed. Doc Harrison arrived that afternoon as promised, his black medical bag in hand and a thoughtful expression on his lined face. Eli watched from the kitchen window as the doctor tied his horse next to Buck and walked toward the cabin with the measured pace of a man who'd seen enough human suffering to know that hurrying rarely helped. "Afternoon, Eli," Doc Harrison said as he stepped through the door. His eyes immediately went to Sarah, who was sitting in the rocking chair with James, while Mary and Joseph lay on their quilt nest, both awake and making the soft sounds that passed for conversation among babies. "Doctor," Sarah said, rising carefully, "I'm Sarah Fletcher. Mr. McGraw was kind enough to suggest you examine the children." Doc Harrison set down his bag and approached with the gentle manner that had made him beloved throughout Cedar Ridge. "May I?" he asked, extending his hands toward James. Sarah hesitated for just a moment, the instinctive pause of a mother who'd learned to be cautious, then handed over her son. Doc Harrison cradled the baby expertly, his experienced eyes taking in every detail of the child's appearance and breathing. "How old?" he asked. 3 weeks yesterday. And they were born where?" "In a cabin near Durango." Sarah's voice was steady, but Eli caught the slight tremor that suggested the memory wasn't entirely pleasant. "A midwife attended the birth." Doc Harrison nodded, continuing his examination of James before moving on to Mary and Joseph. He was thorough but gentle, checking each baby's breathing, examining their eyes and mouths, testing their reflexes with the professional competence of 30 years' practice. "The good news," he said finally, "is that all 3 babies are healthy. James is small, but that's not uncommon with triplets. He'll catch up with proper nutrition and care." He looked at Sarah with kind but perceptive eyes. "The question is whether the mother is getting proper nutrition and care herself." Eli saw Sarah's cheeks flush. "I'm fine, doctor." Doc Harrison wasn't convinced. "When did you last have a proper meal before yesterday?" Sarah's silence was answer enough. Doc Harrison reached into his bag and withdrew a small bottle. "Iron tonic," he explained. "Take a spoonful twice daily. And Mrs. Fletcher, you need to eat regularly. These babies depend on you staying healthy." "I understand." Doc Harrison repacked his bag, but Eli could see the doctor had more to say. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Mrs. Fletcher, I don't mean to pry, but are you safe here? Is there anyone who might be looking for you and the children?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Sarah's hands twisted in her skirt, and she glanced toward the babies before meeting Doc Harrison's eyes. "We're safer here than we were where we came from." "I see." Doc Harrison's tone was neutral, but Eli caught the meaningful look the doctor shot him. "Well then, Eli, might I have a word with you outside?" They stepped onto the porch, leaving Sarah with the babies. Doc Harrison pulled out his pipe and tobacco pouch, taking his time to pack and light it before speaking. "She's running from someone," he said without preamble. "Figured as much. The babies are healthy, but she's been under severe stress. I'd guess she's lost at least 20 pounds since they were born, maybe more. And did you notice her hands?" Eli had noticed. Sarah's hands showed the soft calluses of someone accustomed to fine needlework, but also newer, harder calluses from manual labor and travel. Her fingernails were broken and stained, and there was a fading bruise on her left wrist that she kept hidden under her sleeve. "Someone hurt her," Eli said quietly. "That would be my assessment. The question is, what are you planning to do about it?" Eli looked through the window at Sarah, who was arranging the babies on their quilts with the practiced efficiency of a mother who'd learned to manage alone. "What would you do?" Doc Harrison puffed thoughtfully on his pipe. "I'd give her a safe place to heal, both her and those babies. But Eli, you need to understand what you're taking on. If someone's looking for her, they might come here eventually. Let them come." The words surprised them both. Doc Harrison raised an eyebrow. That's quite a change from the man who spent 15 years avoiding human contact. Eli didn't answer immediately. How could he explain the strange awakening he'd felt since James had first settled against his chest? How could he describe the way Sarah's presence had brought warmth back to rooms that had been cold for so long? "Maybe it's time for a change," he said finally. Doc Harrison studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Well, if you're serious about this, you'll need help. That young woman needs proper food, rest, and someone to talk to besides you, no offense. And those babies will need more care than one person can provide." "What are you suggesting?" "There are women in town who'd help. Mary Hutchins has raised 6 children of her own. Mrs. Patterson, for all her nosiness, knows more about infant care than most doctors. If you're going to do this, Eli, do it right." That evening, after Doc Harrison had gone and the babies were settled for the night, Eli found himself alone with Sarah in the kitchen. She was mending a tear in James's makeshift blanket, her needle moving with practiced precision despite the poor light. "I found something today," she said quietly, not looking up from her work, "when I was cleaning up after the doctor's visit." She reached into her pocket and withdrew a small framed photograph, Eli and Martha on their wedding day, both young and radiantly happy. Eli felt his breath catch. He hadn't seen that photograph in years, had forgotten it was tucked in the drawer of the kitchen table. "She was beautiful," Sarah said gently. "Your wife." Martha. The name felt strange on his tongue after so long. "She died 15 years ago. Consumption." "I'm sorry." Sarah's voice held genuine sympathy. "You must have loved her very much." "Still do." Sarah nodded, understanding. "My husband died too, but not." She stopped, pressing her lips together as if to hold back words that might reveal too much. "Your husband was the father of the babies." "No." The word came out sharp, almost angry. Then more softly, "No, Henry wasn't their father. He was my second husband. My first husband, David, died in a mine accident when I was carrying the children. Henry married me for 4 other reasons." The way she said Henry's name made Eli's hands clench into fists. There was fear there, and hurt, and something else that made his protective instincts flare to life. "Sarah," he said carefully, "are you safe here? Really safe?" She looked up from her mending, meeting his eyes directly for the first time since she'd arrived. "I hope so, Mr. McGraw. For their sake, I really hope so." 3 months passed like pages turning in a well-loved book. The harsh edges of early spring gave way to the gentle warmth of summer, and with it came changes that Eli McGraw could never have imagined when he'd opened his door to a desperate woman and 3 babies on a storm-lashed night. The ranch had come alive again. Sarah proved to have a natural talent for organization and domestic management that transformed the neglected homestead. The kitchen garden, which had grown wild with weeds during Eli's years of solitude, now boasted neat rows of vegetables and herbs. Clean laundry fluttered on the line she'd strung between 2 cottonwoods, and the cabin itself seemed to breathe easier, as if it had been holding its breath for 15 years and could finally exhale. But it was the babies who had truly changed everything. James, Mary, and Joseph had grown strong and healthy under the combined care of Eli and Sarah, developing distinct personalities that never failed to amaze him. James remained the smallest, but his determined spirit more than made up for his size. He was the first to smile, the first to reach for dangling objects, the first to protest when something didn't suit him. Mary was the explorer, constantly trying to roll beyond the safe boundaries of her blankets, her curious eyes taking in everything around her with obvious intelligence. Joseph was the observer, content to lie quietly and watch the world. But Eli had learned to recognize the sharp awareness in those dark eyes. The ledger that Eli had kept meticulously for 23 years now contained new entries. Where once he'd recorded only the mundane details of ranch business, cattle sold, feed purchased, repairs completed now, he found himself noting James's first laugh, Mary's attempt to grab Buck's nose when the old horse leaned over her blanket, Joseph's uncanny ability to sleep through his siblings' crying. On this particular morning, as Eli sat at the kitchen table updating the ledger while Sarah prepared breakfast, he found himself writing an entry that would have seemed impossible just months before. Spoke with Reverend Mitchell about posting bans. Sarah agreed to marriage proposal yesterday evening. The proposal itself had been awkward and practical, delivered while they sat on the porch watching the sunset and listening to the baby's contented sounds from inside the cabin. Eli had cleared his throat twice before finding the words. "Sarah, I've been thinking about our situation here." She'd looked at him with those careful eyes that had learned to watch for danger in ordinary conversations. "What about it? You and the babies, you need legal protection, security, and the way things are now, with you living here without benefit of marriage, well," he gestured helplessly, "the town talks. I know they talk. I'm sorry if that troubles you." "It doesn't trouble me for my sake," he'd said quickly, "but it troubles me for yours, and for the children. If anything happened to me, you'd have no legal claim to this ranch, no way to support yourselves." Sarah had been quiet for a long moment, rocking gently in the chair he'd brought out for her. "Mr. McGrawlier, you proposing marriage?" "I suppose I am. Not for romantic reasons," he'd added hastily, "but for practical ones. To give you and the babies my name and my protection." The silence that followed had stretched so long that Eli had begun to regret his clumsy proposal. But then Sarah had spoken, her voice soft but clear. "Those babies already love you more than they could love their own father, if they'd had one worth loving. And She'd paused, choosing her words carefully. "I've found peace here, Eli, for the first time in longer than I can remember. If you're certain this is what you want, then yes, I'll marry you." Now, 3 days later, Eli was still adjusting to the reality of what they'd agreed to. In 2 weeks, Reverend Mitchell would perform the ceremony in the small church on Cedar Ridge's main street. Mrs. Patterson had already appointed herself wedding coordinator, bustling about with plans for a simple reception and muttering about the impropriety of the whole situation while simultaneously throwing herself into the preparations with obvious enthusiasm. Doc Harrison had been more direct in his response. "About time," he'd said when Eli had told him the news. "That woman's been the best thing to happen to you since Martha, and those babies think you hung the moon. Don't overthink it, Eli. Just be happy." But happiness, Eli was discovering, came with its own complications. The closer the wedding date grew, the more he found himself thinking about Martha, about whether he was betraying her memory by taking another wife. The photograph Sarah had found remained on the kitchen table, and sometimes he caught her looking at it with an expression he couldn't quite read. The bigger concern, though, was the one neither of them spoke about directly. Henry Fletcher, Sarah's abusive second husband, remained a shadow over their growing contentment. Sarah never spoke his name unless forced to, but Eli had noticed how she tensed whenever strangers approached the ranch, how she always positioned herself between the babies and any unknown visitors. Sheriff Tom Bradley had stopped by the week before, ostensibly to check on their welfare, but really to share some disturbing news. "Eli, I need to tell you something. There's been a man asking questions in Durango, calling himself a bounty hunter, looking for a woman who fits Sarah's description, claims she stole something valuable." Eli's blood had run cold. What kind of something? Didn't say specifically, but Eli, Tom's expression had been grim. "This man's got papers, legal documents that say he's got the right to bring her back." "What kind of papers?" "The kind that trumps local law, I'm afraid. Federal warrant." The news had haunted Eli for days. How could he protect Sarah and the babies from someone with federal authority? What good was his offer of marriage if the law itself was on Henry Fletcher's side? He'd shared Tom's warning with Sarah that evening, watching her face go pale as moonlight. "He found us," she'd whispered, her hands instinctively moving to touch the babies, who were sleeping peacefully in their makeshift cribs. "Maybe not. Maybe the man in Durango isn't connected to your Henry." But they both knew that was wishful thinking. Sarah had nodded slowly, her jaw setting with the same determination Eli had seen in James when the baby fought for something he wanted. "Then we'd better get married quickly," she'd said. "If I'm going to face Henry Fletcher again, I want to do it as your wife, with your name and your protection." Now, as Eli closed the ledger and watched Sarah move about his kitchen with the easy competence she'd developed over the months, he felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a familiar coat. These people his family now, in all but law, depended on him, and he'd be damned if he'd let anyone take them away. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by a rider who wouldn't meet Eli's eyes when he handed over the envelope. Sarah's name was written across the front in handwriting that made her face go white as fresh snow. "It's from my sister," she said, but her hands trembled as she broke the seal. Eli watched her read, saw the color drain completely from her cheeks, saw her lips pressed together in a thin line of fear and determination. "What does it say?" he asked gently. Sarah sank into the rocking chair, the letter falling to her lap. "Emma says Henry's been to see her. He's offering a reward for information about my whereabouts. A substantial reward." She looked up at Eli with haunted eyes. "He told her I stole family jewelry when I left. He has legal papers calling me a thief." Eli felt anger rise in his chest like a living thing. "You didn't steal anything." "No, but the jewelry was mine. My grandmother's ring, my mother's necklace, things David gave me before he died. Henry claimed them as his property when we married, said a wife's belongings belonged to her husband." Her voice grew bitter. "I took them when I left because they were all I had left of my first family." "That's not theft, Sarah. Those were your possessions. Try explaining that to a federal marshal." She folded the letter carefully, as if its contents might escape if she wasn't careful. "Emma says Henry's convinced the authorities I'm an unfit mother, that I abandoned my responsibilities and endangered the children by running away. He's painting himself as the concerned stepfather, trying to rescue 3 innocent babies from their irresponsible mother." The full scope of their problem was becoming clear. This wasn't just about an abusive husband trying to reclaim his wife. This was about a man using the law itself as a weapon. And in 1887, a woman's word carried little weight against a man's, especially a man with official documents and a badge. "There's more," Sarah continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Henry isn't just a rancher, Eli. He's a deputy federal marshal. That's how he has the authority to issue warrants and pursue fugitives across state lines." Eli felt the ground shift beneath his feet. A deputy federal marshal. No wonder Sarah had been so frightened, so careful. She wasn't just running from an abusive husband, she was fleeing from someone with the full weight of federal law behind him. "He's been tracking us systematically," Sarah said, reading more from Emma's letter. "He started in Durango, where the babies were born, then followed our trail through the mining camps. Emma says he knows we're somewhere in Colorado territory, and he's working his way through every town between Durango and Denver. How long do we have?" "I don't know. Days, maybe weeks if we're lucky." Sarah looked toward the babies, who were sleeping peacefully in the afternoon sunlight, streaming through the kitchen window. "Eli, I won't let him take them. Whatever else happens, I won't let him get his hands on my children." That evening, after the babies were settled for the night, Eli and Sarah sat on the porch, planning their response to the threat bearing down on them. The wedding was still scheduled for the following week, but now it felt less like a celebration and more like a strategic necessity. "Marriage to me will give you some legal protection," Eli said. "As my wife, you'd have my name and my standing in the community. But would that be enough to stop a federal marshal?" Eli was quiet for a long moment, thinking. During the war, he'd learned that sometimes the best defense was preparation, not just for the attack you expected, but for the one you didn't see coming. "Sarah, I need to know the whole truth, about Henry, about why you married him, about what happened that made you run." Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, despite the warm evening air. "After David died, I was alone and pregnant with triplets. The mining company offered no support to widows, and I had no family nearby except Emma, who could barely support her own children. Henry came to the funeral. He was charming, sympathetic. He offered to marry me, to give the babies his name and me his protection." "And you believed him?" I was desperate, Eli. 22 years old, widowed, carrying 3 babies with no way to support them. Henry seemed like an answer to prayer. Her voice grew hard. The truth came out after we were married. He didn't want a wife. He wanted someone to cook and clean and warm his bed. And he certainly didn't want children. He saw the babies as burdens, mouths, to feed that weren't producing any value. He hurt you. It wasn't a question. Eli had seen enough violence in the war to recognize its after-effects in Sarah's careful movements, her startled responses to sudden sounds, the way she sometimes flinched when he moved too quickly. He said I was ungrateful, that I should be thankful he'd taken on another man's bastards. Sarah's hands clenched into fists. He never touched the babies directly, but he made it clear they weren't welcome. And when I defended them, she didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Eli could see the fading marks of old bruises along her collarbone, could imagine the fear she'd lived with every day. Why didn't you leave sooner? Where would I go? I had no money, no transportation, 3 newborn babies, and Henry made sure I knew that as their legal stepfather, he had rights to the children. He said if I ever tried to leave, he'd have me declared an unfit mother and take them away from me entirely. But you left, anyway. I had to. Sarah's voice broke slightly. He came home drunk one night and started talking about sending the babies to an orphanage. Said 3 infants were too much trouble, that we'd be better off without them. When I protested, she touched her side gingerly. I realized that night that staying meant watching my children grow up in fear, or not grow up at all. Eli reached over and took her hand, feeling the calluses and scars that told the story of her struggle. You're safe now, Sarah. Whatever comes, you and those babies are under my protection. But what if that's not enough? What if Henry's authority trumps everything else? Eli looked out across his land, thinking about the years he'd spent in isolation, convinced that caring about anyone would only lead to pain. Now, faced with the possibility of losing this unexpected family, he felt something awakening in him that had nothing to do with law or authority, and everything to do with love and justice. Then we'll find another way, he said quietly. Sarah, I spent 15 years believing I had nothing left to fight for. I was wrong. Henry Fletcher rode into Cedar Ridge on a Thursday morning, 3 days before the scheduled wedding, accompanied by 2 hard-faced men who wore their guns like working tools. He was a tall man with pale eyes and the kind of smile that never reached beyond his lips. The silver badge pinned to his vest caught the sunlight as he dismounted in front of the sheriff's office, and Sheriff Tom Bradley felt his stomach drop when he saw the federal seal gleaming there. Sheriff Bradley? Henry's voice was smooth, cultured, the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed. I'm Deputy Federal Marshal Henry Fletcher. I believe you've been expecting me. Tom had indeed been expecting him, but that didn't make the moment any easier. Marshal Fletcher, what can I do for you? Henry reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document. I have a federal warrant for the arrest of one Sarah Fletcher, also known as Sarah McGraw. She's wanted for theft of valuable property and child endangerment. Tom accepted the warrant with reluctant hands, scanning the official language that painted Sarah as a criminal and Henry as a wronged husband, seeking justice. The document was thorough, complete with witness statements and property descriptions that would be difficult to dispute in court. Says here she stole jewelry valued at over $500, Tom said carefully. Family heirlooms, Henry confirmed. Belonged to my late mother. Sarah took them when she abandoned her responsibilities as a wife and mother, endangering 3 innocent children in the process. His pale eyes hardened. I've been tracking her for months, Sheriff. I know she's been staying at the McGraw Ranch with the children. The children are healthy and well cared for, Tom said. That's fortunate, but irrelevant. They belong with their legal guardian, me. I married their mother, which makes me their stepfather with full parental rights. Henry's smile was cold. I'm sure you understand the law, Sheriff. Federal warrants supersede local authority. Tom did understand, and that was the problem. No matter what he personally believed about Sarah's character or Henry's motives, the federal warrant gave Henry legal authority that Tom couldn't challenge. I'll need to verify the authenticity of these documents. Of course. Henry gestured to one of his companions, a lean man with scars across his knuckles. This is Deputy Marshal Collins. He'll remain here to assist with the verification process while I go collect my wife and stepchildren. Now hold on, Tom said, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. You can't just ride out there and— Sheriff, Henry interrupted, his voice carrying the quiet menace of absolute authority. I'm not asking for your permission. I'm informing you of my intentions as a courtesy. I will retrieve my wife and the children she stole from me. If anyone interferes with the execution of a federal warrant, they'll face charges of obstruction of justice. Tom felt trapped between law and conscience, between his duty as a sheriff and his loyalty to friends. Let me ride out with you. Make sure everything stays peaceful. That won't be necessary. I prefer to handle family matters privately. The dismissal was clear, and Tom watched helplessly as Henry remounted his horse and rode toward the McGraw ranch with his remaining companion, a thick-set man whose hand never strayed far from his gun. At the ranch, Eli was in the barn, tending to Buck, when he heard the sound of approaching horses. He stepped into the doorway and felt his blood turn to ice water when he saw the 3 riders approaching his cabin. Even at a distance, he could see the badge on the lead rider's chest, could see the purposeful way the men sat their horses. Sarah was in the kitchen with the babies when Eli burst through the door. "Get the children," he said tersely. "Take them to the back bedroom and stay there." She looked up from where she was feeding James, saw the expression on his face, and went pale. "He's here?" 3 men, one with a federal badge. "Move, Sarah, now." But it was too late. The sound of boots on the porch announced their visitors, and a moment later, the door opened without ceremony. Henry Fletcher stepped into Eli's kitchen as if he owned it, his pale eyes taking in the domestic scene with obvious satisfaction. "Sarah," he said, and his voice held the false warmth of a snake in the sun. "You've led me quite a chase, my dear." Sarah had frozen at the sound of his voice, James still in her arms. The baby, sensing his mother's distress, began to fuss. "Henry, and you must be McGraw," Henry continued, turning those cold eyes on Eli. "The man who's been harboring my wife and children. I'm Deputy Federal Marshal Henry Fletcher, and I'm here to collect my family." Eli stepped between Henry and Sarah, his hands loose at his sides but ready. "Those children aren't going anywhere." Henry's smile widened. "I'm afraid that's not your decision to make, McGraw. Sarah is my legal wife, and those children are under my legal guardianship. I have federal warrants for her arrest and custody orders for the children." "Custody orders?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "You can't. They're not even your children." "But I am their legal guardian through marriage to their mother, a fact you seemed to forget when you stole them from their home." Henry reached into his coat and withdrew a second set of documents. "Sheriff Bradley has verified my authority, Sarah. You're under arrest for theft and child endangerment." "She didn't steal anything," Eli said, his voice deadly quiet. "Those were her possessions. Possessions that became mine through marriage, according to territorial law." Henry's companion moved slightly, positioning himself where he could draw his gun quickly if needed. "Everything a wife owns belongs to her husband, McGraw. Surely an old bachelor like you understands that." "I understand that you're a man who hurts women and children." Henry's facade of civility slipped for just a moment, revealing something ugly underneath. "Careful, McGraw. Interference with a federal officer in the performance of his duties is a serious crime." Sarah stepped forward, James still in her arms. "If I come with you, will you leave the babies here? They're healthy and happy, and Mr. McGraw can provide for them." "The children come with me," Henry said firmly. "They're my responsibility, and I won't shirk it any longer." His smile returned, cold and triumphant. "Besides, Sarah, what kind of stepfather would I be if I abandoned children in their time of need?" The full scope of Henry's plan was becoming clear. This wasn't just about reclaiming a runaway wife, this was about punishment. He intended to use the children as weapons against Sarah, to make her suffer for defying him. "There's one thing your legal documents don't account for," Eli said quietly. "Oh, and what's that?" Sarah isn't Sarah Fletcher anymore. As of 3 days ago, she became Sarah McGraw, my wife. Eli reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded paper. Marriage certificate, signed by Reverend Mitchell and witnessed by half the town. Henry's face went white, then red with fury. Impossible! I never granted her a divorce. Didn't need one. You see, Marshal Fletcher, your marriage to Sarah was never legal in the first place. Eli's voice was steady, but Sarah could hear the steel underneath. She was already married. To me, has been for 23 years. The lie was delivered with such conviction that even Sarah almost believed it. Henry snatched the marriage certificate from Eli's hands, scanning it with growing rage. "This is fraud," he snarled. "Marriage fraud, document forgery." "Prove it," Eli said calmly. "Prove that the marriage certificate signed by a respected minister and witnessed by upstanding citizens is fraudulent. Prove that a woman you claim to have married was actually already married to someone else." He stepped closer to Henry, close enough that the marshal could see the absolute determination in his eyes. "Good luck with that in territorial court, Marshal." Henry's hand moved toward his gun, but stopped when he realized both his companions were now facing a kitchen full of potential witnesses. Through the window, he could see several townspeople gathering outside, drawn by the commotion. "This isn't over, McGraw," Henry said, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "I'll be back with proof of your fraud, and when I am, you'll both face federal charges." "Looking forward to it," Eli replied, and somehow Sarah believed he really was. The 3 days following Henry Fletcher's departure passed like the calm before a tornado. Eli knew the marshal would be. Backmen like Henry didn't accept defeat gracefully, especially not public humiliation in front of witnesses. The fraudulent marriage certificate had bought them time, but time was a finite resource, and Henry would use every minute of it to build an unassailable case. Eli spent those days preparing for war. He cleaned and oiled his old cavalry pistol, the Colt .45 that had served him through 3 years of fighting Confederate forces. The weapon felt familiar in his hands, awakening muscle memories he'd thought buried with his military past. He also retrieved his cavalry saber from the trunk where it had lain wrapped in oilcloth for 22 years. The blade was still sharp, still balanced perfectly in his grip. But weapons alone wouldn't win this fight. What Eli needed was allies, and to his surprise, Cedar Ridge provided them in abundance. Doc Harrison was the first to offer support, arriving at the ranch the morning after Henry's visit with his medical bag and a grim expression. "Eli, I've been thinking about our friend Marshal Fletcher. There's something not quite right about his story." "What do you mean?" "I've delivered a lot of babies in my time, and I've never seen triplets as healthy and well-developed as James, Mary, and Joseph if their mother had been suffering from neglect or abuse during pregnancy." Doc Harrison set down his bag and accepted the coffee Sarah offered. "Those children show every sign of having been well-nourished and carefully tended from conception through birth. That doesn't match Fletcher's claims about Sarah being an unfit mother." Sarah looked up from where she was changing Joseph's diaper. "Henry wasn't around much during my pregnancy. He said the sight of me made him sick." "Convenient," Doc Harrison said dryly. "Sarah, I'd like to examine you thoroughly and document my findings. If Fletcher comes back with more legal papers, medical testimony about your fitness as a mother might carry weight with a territorial judge." The examination took place that afternoon, with Doc Harrison making careful notes about Sarah's health, her obvious competence with the children, and the clear signs that she'd received proper prenatal care despite Fletcher's claims of neglect. He also documented the fading bruises on her ribs and arms, evidence of the abuse she'd suffered. "This will help," he told Eli privately, "but it might not be enough. Fletcher's got federal authority on his side." Mrs. Patterson surprised everyone by arriving the next day with a basket of food and an unexpected offer of assistance. "Eli McGraw, I don't know what kind of trouble you've gotten yourself into, but I know Sarah Fletcher McGraw, I should say, and she's a good woman with good children. If that badge-wearing bully thinks he can come into our town and terrorize decent folks, he's got another think coming." Mrs. Patterson, this is federal business. Federal business, my foot. Eleanor Patterson's eyes flashed with indignation. I've seen how that woman cares for those babies, how she's brought life back to this ranch. And I've got eyes to see the kind of man that Marshall is. The way he looked at her wasn't the way a concerned husband looks at his wife, it was the way a hunter looks at prey. Her words carried weight because Eleanor Patterson wasn't known for charitable opinions. If she was defending Sarah, it meant the entire town was watching and forming judgments. Sheriff Tom Bradley rode out on the second day, his expression troubled. Eli, I've been thinking about Fletcher's warrant. Something's bothering me about the paperwork. What kind of something? The theft charges are dated 3 months ago, but the witness statements are all dated within the last month. Either Fletcher waited 3 months to report valuable property stolen by his wife, or he fabricated the charges recently to justify pursuing her. Eli felt a spark of hope. Can you prove that? Maybe. I've sent a wire to the federal marshal's office in Denver asking for verification of Fletcher's credentials and case details. If there are inconsistencies, we might have grounds to challenge his authority. That evening, as Sarah put the babies to bed, Eli found himself studying the faces of the 3 children who had become so precious to him. James had grown stronger over the months, his determined spirit shining through increasingly bright smiles. Mary's curiosity had developed into a fearless exploration of her small world, and Joseph's quiet observation had revealed an intelligence that seemed remarkable for one so young. The thought of Henry Fletcher getting his hands on these innocent children filled Eli with a cold rage he hadn't felt since the war. But rage alone wouldn't protect them. He needed strategy, planning, and the willingness to do whatever was necessary when the moment came. "Sarah," he said as she returned to the kitchen, "I want you to know something. That marriage certificate, I showed Fletcher it, may have been dated 3 days ago, but the feelings behind it are real. Somewhere along the way, this stopped being about protection and started being about love." Sarah looked at him with those careful eyes that had learned to watch for deception. "Eli, you don't have to say that. I understand this is all about keeping the children safe." "Is it?" He reached across the table and took her hand. "Sarah, these months with you and the babies have been the happiest I've known since Martha died. You've brought life back to this house, back to me. When I look at James, Mary, and Joseph, I don't see someone else's children, I see my family. When I look at you," he paused, searching for words. "When I look at you, I see the woman I want to spend whatever years I have left with." Tears gathered in Sarah's eyes, even knowing what it might cost. Henry won't give up easily. He'll come back with more men, more authority. He might destroy everything you've built here. Then we'll build it again somewhere else. Eli's voice was steady. "Sarah, I spent 15 years believing I was too old, too broken, too set in my ways to start over. You've shown me I was wrong about all of it." The next morning brought Reverend Mitchell to their door, his kind face creased with concern. "Eli, Sarah, I've heard about the troubles you're facing. I want you to know the church stands behind you. Reverend, this could get dangerous. All the more reason to stand together." The elderly minister's voice was firm. "I've married this couple legally and in the sight of God. That marshal may have federal papers, but I have something stronger than moral authority of a community that knows right from wrong." Word had spread through Cedar Ridge with the speed that only small-town gossip could achieve. By the afternoon of the 3rd day, a steady stream of visitors had made their way to the McGraw Ranch. Farmers who hadn't spoken to Eli in years came to offer their support. Women who barely knew Sarah brought gifts for the babies and promises to testify to her character, if needed. Even the Silver Dollar's regular customers, men not known for their charitable impulses, stopped by to express their opinions about federal marshals who bullied women and children. The consensus was clear: Cedar Ridge would protect its own. As the sun set on the 3rd day, Eli stood on his porch with his cavalry saber at his side, watching the road that led to town. Buck stood in the corral nearby, saddled and ready despite his age. In the kitchen, Sarah was feeding the babies what might be their last peaceful meal for some time. Doc Harrison had moved into the spare room for the duration, claiming he wanted to be available if medical assistance was needed, but really positioning himself as another defender. Sheriff Bradley had stationed himself at the end of the drive, officially neutral but clearly prepared to intervene if Fletcher overstepped his authority. The town bell began to ring just as the last light faded from the sky, 3 long peals followed by 3 short ones, the signal they'd arranged to announce Fletcher's return. Eli touched the saber's hilt, feeling the familiar weight of the weapon that had seen him through the darkest moments of the war. Tomorrow would bring the confrontation that would determine the fate of his new family. Tonight, he would hold vigil, ready to fight for the love that had unexpectedly transformed his life from hollow existence to purposeful joy. In the distance, he could see torches moving along the road toward town. Henry Fletcher was coming back, and this time he wouldn't be alone. Dawn came grey and cold, with the kind of mountain mist that muffled sound and made distances deceptive. Eli had spent the night on the porch, dozing fitfully in the rocking chair with his cavalry pistol across his lap and the saber propped against the wall beside him. Every creak of settling wood, every whisper of wind through the cottonwoods had brought him instantly alert. The town bell began its urgent clanging at first light, not the measured peals of the evening before, but the rapid, insistent rhythm that meant immediate danger. Through the mist, Eli could see riders approaching on the main road, more than the 3 who had come before. Henry Fletcher had returned with reinforcements. Sarah appeared in the doorway, fully dressed despite the early hour. She carried Joseph in her arms, while James and Mary remained inside in their makeshift cribs, safely away from what was about to unfold. "How many?" she asked quietly. 6, maybe 7. Eli rose from the chair, checking his weapons one final time. "Sarah, I want you to take the babies to the back bedroom and stay there no matter what happens." "Eli, promise me." His voice was gentle but implacable. "Whatever you hear out here, whatever happens, you protect those children first." She nodded, tears threatening but held back by sheer force of will. "I love you, Eli McGraw. If this goes badly, I want you to know that these months with you have been the happiest of my life." Before he could respond, she was gone, disappearing into the cabin with Joseph. Eli heard her speaking softly to the other babies, her voice calm and reassuring despite the terror that must be coursing through her veins. The riders emerged from the mist like phantoms gaining substance. Henry Fletcher rode in the lead, his federal badge catching what little light filtered through the overcast sky. Behind him came 6 hard-faced men, some wearing deputy badges, others with the look of hired guns who asked no questions as long as the pay was good. They formed a loose semicircle in front of the cabin, close enough to demonstrate their intent but far enough back to avoid being surprised by resistance. Henry dismounted with theatrical confidence, straightening his coat and adjusting his badge so it was prominently displayed. "McGraw," he called, "I've come for my wife and children. Send them out and there won't be any trouble." Eli stepped down from the porch, moving with the measured pace of a man who had faced armed enemies before. His pistol remained holstered, but his hand rested casually near the grip. "Those children aren't going anywhere, Fletcher." "I have new evidence," Henry said, reaching into his saddlebags. He withdrew a thick sheaf of papers and waved them triumphantly. "Proof that your marriage certificate is fraudulent. Proof that Sarah McGraw is actually Sarah Fletcher, my legal wife, and that those children are under my guardianship." "What kind of proof?" Henry's smile was cold and satisfied. "Marriage records from Durango showing that Sarah Fletcher married me 18 months ago. Witness statements from townspeople who knew her as my wife. And most damning of all, he held up a final document, a birth certificate for the triplets, listing Henry Fletcher as their legal father." Eli felt his blood run cold. Forged or not, those documents would carry weight in any territorial court. Henry had used his time well, building a case that would be difficult to challenge through legal means. "You're a liar, Fletcher. Those children aren't yours, and you know it. Can you prove that? Can you prove that I didn't marry their mother legally? Can you prove that I'm not their rightful father?" Henry's voice rose with triumphant anger. "I have federal authority, McGraw. I have legal documentation. What do you have?" The answer came not from Eli, but from the sound of Mrs. Patterson's voice calling from the direction of town. "He has the support of this entire community, you badge-wearing bully." Through the mist came a sight that made Henry Fletcher's confidence falter. Eleanor Patterson was marching up the road toward the ranch, and behind her came what looked like half the population of Cedar Ridge. Doc Harrison walked beside her, his medical bag in one hand and a shotgun in the other. Sheriff Bradley followed with a grim expression and his hand on his gun. Behind them came farmers, shopkeepers, ranch hands, and even Reverend Mitchell, all moving with the determined pace of people who had made a collective decision about right and wrong. "This is federal business," Henry shouted as the crowd approached. "I order you to disperse." "This is our town," Mrs. Patterson replied sharply, "and these are our people. If you think you can come here and terrorize decent folks with your papers and your badges, you're mistaken." Doc Harrison stepped forward, his weathered face set in stern lines. "Marshal Fletcher, I've examined those children thoroughly. They show every sign of excellent care from birth. They are healthy, well-nourished, and clearly loved. Your claims of neglect and endangerment are medically unsupported." "Medical opinions don't override federal law," Henry snarled, but Eli could see uncertainty creeping into his pale eyes. He'd expected to face one old rancher, not an entire community. "Maybe not," Sheriff Bradley said quietly, "but I've received some interesting information from Denver about your credentials, Marshal Fletcher. Seems there are some questions about your authority to issue warrants in this territory." Henry Fletcher's face flushed red at Sheriff Bradley's words, but his voice remained controlled. "My credentials are perfectly legitimate, Sheriff. Any questions from Denver are simply administrative delays." "Maybe so," Tom Bradley replied, pulling a telegram from his pocket. "But according to this wire from the Territorial Marshal's office, Deputy Fletcher's authority to pursue fugitives was suspended 3 weeks ago, pending investigation of irregularities in several cases." The words hit Henry like physical blows. His hired guns shifted nervously, suddenly unsure about the legal ground they were standing on. But Henry Fletcher hadn't survived as a corrupt lawman by accepting defeat easily. "Suspended authority or not," he said, his hand moving toward his gun, "those children are coming with me. Sarah is my wife, and I'll be damned if I let some broken-down rancher and a bunch of townspeople keep me from what's mine." The pretense of legal process was falling away, revealing the violent reality underneath. This was no longer about warrants or authority. This was about a dangerous man's obsession with control and revenge. "Sarah!" Henry shouted toward the cabin. "Come out here now, or I start shooting!" Eli's hand closed on his pistol grip. "You want those children, Fletcher? You'll have to go through me first." "Gladly." Henry drew his weapon with the smooth motion of a man who'd drawn it many times before. But Eli McGraw had been drawing guns in life-or-death situations since before Henry Fletcher was born, and his Colt cleared leather a split second faster. The shot echoed across the ranch like thunder, and Henry's gun flew from his hand as Eli's bullet shattered his wrist. "Son of a..." Henry clutched his bleeding hand, his face twisted with rage and pain. "Kill him! Kill them all!" But his hired guns found themselves facing not just one old rancher, but an entire community armed and ready to fight. Doc Harrison's shotgun boomed, sending buckshot into the ground at the feet of the nearest gunman. Sheriff Bradley had his pistol drawn and pointed at another. The townspeople, armed with everything from hunting rifles to pitchforks, formed a determined wall between the hired guns and the ranch. "Stand down!" Tom Bradley shouted. "All of you, stand down. This has gone far enough." One of Henry's men, a scarred veteran with cold eyes, ignored the warning and swung his rifle toward the crowd. Eli's second shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him from his saddle. The man hit the ground hard and lay still, his weapon falling harmlessly into the dust. "The next man who draws a weapon dies," Eli said quietly, his smoking pistol steady in his hand. "This is my land, these are my people, and those children are under my protection." For a moment, The tableau held armed men facing each other across 30 yards of ranch yard, the morning mist swirling around them like smoke from some ancient battlefield. Then Sarah Fletcher stepped out of the cabin, carrying all 3 babies. "Enough," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Enough violence, enough fear, enough running." She walked toward Henry, who was still clutching his wounded wrist. "You want to know the truth, Henry? You want to know why I really left?" "Sarah, get back inside," Eli warned, but she shook her head. "No, Eli. It's time everyone knew exactly what kind of man Henry Fletcher really is." She stopped, just out of his reach, the babies calm in her arms, despite the chaos around them. "You never wanted to marry me, Henry. You wanted to own me. You married a pregnant widow because you thought I'd be grateful enough to accept any treatment you chose to give. You ungrateful. You told me you'd have my children taken away if I ever crossed you. You said you'd have me declared insane and put in an asylum." Sarah's voice grew stronger with each word. "But the real truth is, you were never their stepfather, because you were never really my husband." Henry's face went white. "What are you talking about?" Sarah reached into her dress and withdrew a folded paper knot, the forged marriage certificate Eli had shown him before, but something else entirely. "This is my real marriage certificate, Henry. To David Fletcher, James's father. Signed by a minister in Durango, 6 months before David died in the mine accident." The implications hit Henry like a physical blow. If Sarah had been legally married to David Fletcher when the babies were born, and if David was indeed their father, then Henry's subsequent marriage to her was null and void. His claims to the children had no legal foundation whatsoever. "But we were married." "We went through a ceremony," Sarah confirmed. "But I was still in mourning for David, still legally his widow." In territorial law, a widow can't remarry for a full year after her husband's death without special dispensation from a territorial judge. "We never sought that dispensation, Henry, which means our marriage was never legal." "Mrs." Patterson's voice cut through the stunned silence. "In other words, Marshall Fletcher, you've been chasing a woman who was never actually your wife and children, who were never under your authority." Henry Fletcher stood swaying in his saddle, blood dripping from his wounded wrist, his entire carefully constructed case crumbling around him. When he looked up, his pale eyes held the desperate fury of a man who had lost everything and had nothing left to lose. "If I can't have them," he snarled, reaching for a second gun with his good hand, "then nobody can." 6 months later, on a crisp October morning that painted the cottonwoods gold and crimson, Eli McGraw sat on his porch, watching his wife hang laundry while their 3 children played on a quilt spread beneath the trees. The scene was so peaceful, so perfectly ordinary, that sometimes he had to remind himself it was real. Henry Fletcher was in the territorial prison in Denver, serving a 15-year sentence for corruption, assault with a deadly weapon, and a dozen other charges that had surfaced once investigators began looking into his activities. His hired guns had scattered like tumbleweeds in a windstorm the moment their employer was arrested. The last Eli had heard, most of them were working cattle drives in Texas, far from the Colorado Territory and the long arm of federal law. The investigation that followed Henry's arrest had revealed a pattern of abuse that stretched back years. 3 other women came forward with stories of marriages to Henry Fletcher that had ended in violence and threats. 2 of them had children who had simply disappeared one day, taken by their stepfather and never seen again. Sarah's courage in standing up to him had not only saved her own children, but had brought justice for crimes that might otherwise have remained hidden forever. James, Mary, and Joseph were thriving. At 9 months old, they were sitting up on their own, babbling in what Eli insisted were complete sentences, and showing distinct personalities that never failed to delight him. James had indeed proven to be the determined fighter Doc Harrison had predicted, overcoming his early frailty to become as robust as his siblings. Mary remained the explorer, constantly attempting to crawl beyond the safe boundaries of her play area. Joseph continued to observe everything with those intelligent, dark eyes, but now he smiled readily and reached for Eli whenever the old rancher appeared. The ranch itself had been transformed. With Sarah's organizational skills and the help of neighbors who had become genuine friends, the operation was more successful than it had been even in Martha's time. They were running a small herd of cattle again. The vegetable garden provided more than enough for their needs, and Eli had even taken on a hired hand, a young man named Tom Patterson, Mrs. Patterson's nephew, who was learning the ranching business. But the greatest transformation was in Eli himself. The bitter hermit who had opened his door to strangers on a storm-lashed night was gone, replaced by a man who had rediscovered joy in the simple act of living. His neighbors no longer saw him as the broken widower to be pitied, but as the patriarch of a growing family and a respected member of the community. On this particular morning, as Sarah finished hanging the last of the baby clothes and came to sit beside him on the porch, Eli reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. In his lap lay Martha's completed quilt. Sarah had finished the wedding ring pattern during the long winter months, adding her own touches while honoring the original design. The quilt now covered their marriage bed, a symbol of continuity and healing that bridged past and present. "What are you thinking about?" Sarah asked, settling into the rocking chair beside him. "Everything," Eli said simply. "How different life is from what I expected it would be. Better or worse?" He looked at her, really looked at her, noting how the months of good food and peaceful living had restored the bloom to her cheeks, how happiness had softened the careful wariness in her eyes. "Better than I ever dared to hope." Sarah smiled, reaching over to take his weathered hand in hers. "I never thanked you properly, you know." "For what?" "For saving us, for giving us your name and your protection, for loving children who weren't yours by blood." Eli squeezed her hand gently. "Sarah, those children became mine the moment I held James that first night. Biology doesn't make a father, love does. Commitment does. Being there when they need you does." As if summoned by their conversation, James chose that moment to tumble off the quilt and begin crawling determinedly toward the porch. Mary immediately followed, not to be outdone by her brother, while Joseph remained sitting and clapping his hands in apparent approval of his siblings' adventure. "Speaking of being there when they need you," Sarah said with amusement, "I think your children are about to explore the porch steps." Eli rose with a grunt of mock complaint but obvious delight, walking down to gather the two adventurers before they could get into serious trouble. He scooped up James and Mary, one in each arm, and carried them back to the quilt while they giggled and grabbed at his beard. "Your papa's getting old," he told them solemnly. "Pretty soon you'll be faster than he is." But as he settled them back on their quilt and watched them immediately begin planning their next escape attempt, Eli realized he had never felt less old in his life. These children had given him purpose, energy, and a reason to look forward to tomorrow that he hadn't possessed in 15 years. Doc Harrison arrived for his weekly visit just as the babies were being fed their noon meal, a chaotic but joyful process that usually left more food on the participants than in them. He examined each child with the thorough care that had made him the most trusted physician in the territory, then pronounced them all perfectly healthy and growing like weeds. "Eli," he said as they sat on the porch sharing a cup of coffee, "I have to ask you something. Do you ever regret opening that door on the night of the storm?" Eli looked through the window at Sarah, who was putting the babies down for their afternoon nap, humming the same gentle melody that Martha used to sing. He thought about the man he had been 6 months ago, isolated, bitter, convinced that his life was essentially over. Then he thought about the man he was now, husband, father, active member of a community that had rallied to protect his family when they needed it most. "Sam," he said finally, "that was the best decision I ever made in my life. Sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as burdens. Sometimes opening your door to strangers means opening your heart to family. And sometimes, when you think your story is over, you discover it's just beginning." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Eli McGraw sat surrounded by the love he had never expected to find again. grateful for storms that bring unexpected blessings and second chances that arrive precisely when they're needed most.